Hello, everyone. This is Kyle.
And this is Daniel.
And we just wanted to jump in here at the beginning of the episode to offer some updates and some information. So the first thing we need to get out here is a huge thank you to every single person who decided to take a chance, download, stream, listen to our podcast, tell friends.
Yeah, the support and the encouragement that's come from so many people from so many different walks of life that have caught the vision behind the podcast and are on board with it has really been encouraging to both of us. Specifically, I think the fact that we are hearing from people that are hardened atheists and hardened Christians, but then also people from every walk in between, agnostics, not quite sure, Eastern. And so it's just been really humbling, I think, to know that you guys are listening and appreciating this.
Yeah, which brings us to our next topic, which is feedback, which is we enjoy the feedback that we've been hearing. We get it. I don't sit close enough to the mic from when we were recording way back like 4 months ago now at this point. And we're going to be taking that feedback to create not just a better podcast, but as we go forward with like season 2 and onward, this is just going to get better and better.
Yeah, one of the things we want to just mention is that we recorded all the episodes for season 1 months ago, and we're now, of course, about halfway through that journey. So the feedback, you might not notice it being applied right away, but we are noting it and we are going to apply it later. If you have feedback on the content, so questions, insights, maybe objections, we'd love to hear from that too. If you could email us or drop us a line on Facebook or Twitter, we want to incorporate that into further episodes.
Yeah. Assumptionspod@gmail.com. You can send your comments and questions there. What is coming up in the last half
of our
podcast?
Our next episode, the one that you're listening to right now, is on Harry Potter. We're going to be talking about alternative storytelling, including video games. We're going to be talking about why we ourselves want to create and that desire to create. Where does it come from? Where does it lead? We're going to be talking about the social media aspect of storytelling and how our timelines are a sense of telling our own story. And then I think my favorite episode, we are going to title it The Cathedral and the Cinema, and it looks at two aspects of our lives that are kind of a cultural point of storytelling. I can't wait for that one.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun. Last thing before Daniel tells a story here is to also rate and review in iTunes. Or whatever podcasting software you like to use. It really does help us out in the rankings. Lets other people discover this podcast. So if you could go and leave a rating and a review in whatever podcasting software you use, it'd be a big help to us.
Yeah, basically it lets us get featured and gets more people to hopefully hear the show.
So Daniel, I also hear that you are hobnobbing with Hollywood directors.
That's right. I covered a film festival recently here in Calgary, and my favorite film from the festival was called Some Freaks by Ian McAllister MacDonald, and I wrote a review of it and then was surprised and delighted to get an email from Ian thanking me for the review, and he also said that he listened to the podcast and is on board with it, and what he says is that he respects the idea behind assumptions. It feels like an important contribution towards modern discourse, which is becoming obviously increasingly polarized and uncommunicative. This podcast feels like a kind of a remedy for that. So when you're listening, you can count yourself in the ranks of listeners alongside this excellent director. And I think he articulated our vision for the show quite well in that email. And the point is we feel like we're polarizing, or we're just not going to talk about these things, but this being friends gives us a chance to do it without a lot of that baggage and a lot of that tension that so often exists in these conversations.
Exactly. So here's to the last half starting now.
Yes, introducing our next episode.
Enjoy. Potter is this pop cultural juggernaut, if I can steal
What does that word
phrase.
mean, juggernaut?
Well, Juggernaut is a comic book character who likes to crash through things.
Oh, really?
No. Well, it is.
Okay,
but I don't think that's... I don't, that is true. He's an X-Men character, but I mean, I don't think that's specifically where that term came from.
Comics are influential.
I am going to guess that it's a German word of some kind, as everything tend to be.
I fall down to my knees. Eyes are raised to the sky. I fall down to my knees.
Well, we're sitting here in your room right now.
Yeah.
We are recording this episode the day that Donald Trump gets inaugurated as the 45th president of the United States. But all I see are just piles and piles of books in front of me.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that I think you and I do share something of a kinship in that our first real love of storytelling comes from the written word.
Absolutely. Yeah.
From books, from the running down of good yarns that we can grab onto and hold.
Did your parents read to you?
Did, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I crave that every night. I don't know what stories you were read to. I'm
the
assuming
Bible.
Bible stories.
Everything. No, I had a lot. I had the Bible stories, and my earliest memory is having a picture book of the Bible, which is downstairs on my bookshelf right now, read to me on the couch. But my mom went out of the way to find us really good quality children's books.
Sure.
Whether those are chapter books, but initially picture books, and really grateful for that. I see some of the trash that kids read these days, and
Right.
I'm just like, wow, you put a lot of work into this, Mom. Thank you.
Yeah, you might as well burn the Purple Crayon. What a piece of garbage. How was going to bed knowing that Abraham was about to kill his 2 kids?
Oh, well, my daddy was reading it to me, and he was very trustworthy, so it was
Okay. He did have that knife with him, though.
Yeah, it was a little...
That was a little bit suspect. So for me, I was kind of the traditional stories that were being told to me. So a lot of Dr. Seuss, a lot of the Berenstain Bears.
We hated those growing up.
Dr. Seuss is still a love of mine. I think he writes really interesting, great stuff if you go back to it as an adult. But what else? There was a lot of those kind of picture chapter books. There was the, I'm going to forget the name. They had the gold bind on them though for kids books, the golden books.
Yeah,
I think they're just called golden books.
Yeah.
So my mom had the entire collection of those things
Yeah.
that would read through, those types of things.
Yeah, so you grew up on trash, okay?
I grew up on trash. Yeah, exactly. But that's what I got onto, and then I started reading at a pretty advanced level. So I was reading young adult novels by the time I was in grade 3.
Oh wow, okay.
So I was reading a lot of like Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys fiction and stuff like that. That's what I really loved a lot when I was that age. And then there was this author who does live here in Alberta, Red Deer specifically, named Sigmund Brouwer.
Okay, yep.
And he had this series called The Accidental Detectives, which I was a huge fan of.
Yeah.
A lot of mystery fiction, really. Now that I'm thinking of it, I never really thought about that. But a lot of mystery fiction when I was growing up until I found, J.R.R. Tolkien. I read the Lord of the Rings when I was in like grade 6, and I was like, oh, this fantasy thing seems like something I might like, and then that kind of opened the doors for.
I didn't read those until like grade 9.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I was reading all that stuff. I was reading Robert Jordan by the time I was in grade 8, so who was another fantasy author who wrote like 14 books in his big long series.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I grew up, my mom would find these picture books from the library quite often, or would have them. A lot of Richard Scarry, Curious George, but then also ones that, I remember, one quality of those books, I remember, were high quality illustrations, very realistic. We didn't find a lot of ones that were very cartoonish. They tended to be more realistic and drawings for both the Bible books we read as well as the ones from the library. And so a lot of those. And then chapter books, we did a lot of read-alouds growing up. So it was a big part of, I think, the homeschool life.
So you just read a chapter or read a paragraph, or how did that work?
No, so what would happen is Mom would read the book aloud to us.
Oh,
so
I see.
she'd have a chapter book that was a little bit advanced, maybe our own reading level, and then we would all sit and do some crafts, and she would read these books aloud. And so there were all kinds of, we read historical novels, we read, I remember books about like ancient Greece, or the Renaissance, or different characters scattered across Europe. And it just gave me a sort of a love for the world, I think, and a sense of discovery of that. And then a big part of my growing up was the Asterix and Tintin novels. The graphic novels, the only comics that I really read as a kid. And then got to the point where I'd say when I look at my childhood, there's 2 landmarks. There's the outdoors. We spent a lot of time outdoors, and we spent a lot of time in the library, and just coming home with stacks of books. But how old were you when the Harry Potter novels kind of made their... Did you read them as they were coming out?
Sort of.
Okay.
I started reading the Harry Potter books just after the 4th book came out. So if I can remember this properly...
How old were you?
I was in high school, so I would have been grade 11 or 12, I think, when that 4th one came out.
Okay.
So I believe the first book of Harry Potter was released in 96 or 97, something around there, which means that I would have been in 89. Let me do the quick math here. I would have been in grade 8. Grade 8 when the first book came out, roughly grade 8.
Okay.
So yeah, I didn't even know about Harry Potter
Sure.
until high school. That's when really the phenomenon, I think, was starting to percolate
Right.
a little bit more. Because those first 2 books, of course, the first book comes out and it's not going to be a huge thing.
But
But you keep
it
hearing
was
more.
a huge thing by the time that...
Yeah, by that 4th book,
Yeah.
like people were talking about
Yeah.
this now, and not just kids talking about it, but adults
Yes.
and stuff like that too. So I picked them up from the local bookstore in my small little Canadian town that I grew up in, and I read them. And I distinctly remember, because I was a little bit of an older reader at that point, reading the first book. I'm like, this is fun, but this is a standard kids book. And if you read a lot of children's fiction, I mean, if when you grow up, you can expect a few different things to happen. I think we've talked about this, whether it was on podcast or off, I don't remember, how when you look at children's fiction, there's a lot of things that carry over, meaning there's an orphan or their parents not accessible, usually some sort of evil parent person over top of them. They have to go on a journey of some kind and grab something. So there's a whole
And
lot
she
of
distorts
things.
that. She kind of pushes it. It's almost like a Lemony Snicket kind of. Let's take this to the extreme.
Yeah, sure.
But then it changes. So was it something that? Because we'll talk about this in a little bit. My experience with them, but just I didn't grow up reading them.
Yeah.
And what was it like in reading that as they came
Well,
out?
after that point, this is going to be hard for anyone who didn't go through that, and it's what I feel like kind of with the Game of Thrones books as well, is that in 20 years from now, when that 5th book comes out, in 20 years from now, when all the books have actually been written, it's going to be so hard to have that, to understand when people come to them and be like, we had to wait 8 years between when this book ended and this one started again. You get to pick it up like right away and start to understand what was going on. And the first 4 came out pretty quickly. It was like a year or 2 that were between them.
She took her time.
And then she took her time. And then the 5th book came out, and even though I wasn't the hugest fan of the 5th book, I still like devoured that.
Yeah.
And then you had to wait another like 4 years before the 6th one came out. And then finally that 7th book came out that we could see how it all got wrapped up together.
Right.
But I think what you're going to lose a little bit with that, and this is kind of coupled with the internet culture that was just coming up at that same time. I think it hit right at the right time, because I was going on message boards and communities and be like, what do you think's going to happen? Like all the fan theories and seeing what actually came
Breaking
true.
Bad, I think, was the closest thing.
Oh, that you had?
Yeah,
and
when it was
like
when it was coming out. You're like, what is going to happen?
Well, and that's a whole other conversation, but you have the 2 different fields of that, where you have the Harry Potter one, which is really interesting, and people have their fan theories, and they talk about their favorite characters, and what they think should happen, and the themes that are in this world that's going on. And then you have, I don't know if you were ever a True Detective fan or have watched the first season of True Detective, but people were on message boards about that show, and I wasn't. I watched that whole show after it aired, so I watched them all like right away. Loved it. And then I went on, and people had built themselves up to so much to think that was a fantasy show where there's going to be some sort of like horror
Lost
or
kind of thing.
like a fantasy creature come out, which I never picked up on at all while watching that show. But people were convinced that this show was about one thing, and it turned out to not be about that thing.
Whereas Harry Potter wasn't.
Everybody did not pull the rug underneath
that.
it. Now there's some criticism I can level at it about one plot point, which I think is brought in a lot late into the story, and you've not ever heard about it before up until that point. It's like that feels a little cheap,
right?
But
it was something that when you were reading it, you were immersed in it. You were it was this world that she created. That
I mean, this gets to not necessarily worldview, but this gets more to my theories or what I like about fiction specifically. A lot of people talk about how we are drawn to stories, and I agree with that. We're drawn to stories. Yeah. But the story is only as good as the characters that are inside of it. Right. And I think really we're drawn to really interesting or well-drawn characters. We're allowed, or we're able to go along with a narrative that might be meandering a bit, or a little bit like, okay, this isn't going where I want it to, but I'm still on board if we still like the characters, or if we're still understanding where the characters are going. Right. And I think Harry Potter does that extremely well. We do have the central character of Harry, but if it was just Harry in those books, I don't think it would be as good. No. It's good because we have Ron, and we have Hermione, and we have Hagrid, and we have Dumbledore, and Professor McGonagall, and we have all these other side characters, and the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher that happens every year.
And the world creation of it, I think, is something that when I read the first novel recently, and I didn't like it that much, like you said, it was kind of average. But as I went into it, it was the world she created that hooked me right in, because it is so believable and it's so much fun to be in. But my experience with Harry Potter was different, because I remember the first time I heard it, my mom was listening to CBC on the radio, and they were talking about something about Potter, and I was like, oh mom, they're talking about Beatrix Potter, which we grew up reading and then loved. And she's like, nope, they're talking about witchcraft, the opposite. And it really was this thing where here's this series of books that's teaching kids about the school of witchcraft and wizardry, and we avoided it. And I hope this is true. This is a childhood memory of mine, which could be made up, but I remember talking to my mom, and she said, yeah, J.K. Rowling's getting really rich, and I think she made a pact with the devil to like convince people about that witchcraft was good, and the kids are going to read these stories and they're just going to get darker and darker, but they'll be hooked into it, and she'll be really rich because of it. And I was like, oh wow. I really hope that's like almost not true, because it's so bad, but that was the belief that I had growing up, was that these were of the devil, to be avoided. And then what comes with that is this sense of disdain towards them, and even believing that they're just crap. And so I remember having friends that would occasionally have a Harry Potter branded piece of memorabilia, and I'd go, no, that's just, I wouldn't want to hang out with them, and that was a matter of conscience not to associate myself with these people.
So that's really interesting.
It's interesting, yeah.
So a very different upbringing.
Oh yeah, definitely.
What made you eventually come to it then? Like what forced you to want to go and read them?
It's interesting because there was that disdain towards them. There was that contrast with the good Christian literature, like C.S. Lewis, Narnia. But I eventually got to the point where a lot of my favorite Christian leaders, so teachers that I really respected, they all listed them as some of their favorite books, and listed the fact that they had these deep Christian themes at the heart of them, which I remember mentioning this to my dad just this summer, and he started, what do you mean? What on earth could there be a Christian theme in Harry Potter? And then the fact that I wanted to be better friends with people like you who grew up reading them,
right.
I decided to pick up the series and made my way through it just this last summer. And I read all 7 books, and then about half a dozen of the kind of companion books that she wrote about the world.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I love kind of geeking out about Harry Potter because I think there's a specialness to them, and it's it is very much this singular thing that happened in my life where there was this much fervor over a book series.
Sure.
Game of Thrones is kind of like that, but it's not quite as wide ranging. It's a very specific group that loves that series. Whereas Harry Potter was like kids and adults and like from 9 to 90 people were there, and I had the fortune for the last book that came out to be working at a bookstore. And I was there at the midnight release when that book came out, and that was a really cool experience to be in on that, and just seeing kids like excited about this book. Like nothing could be better in the world than being able to grab a book and read it right then and read the whole thing in one sitting. It was just fun. It was just a fun thing to be around.
And I remember my parents saying, like, well, just because it's reading doesn't mean it's good.
But I mean, I agree with that. And I think that to a certain extent, your mother is not necessarily 100% wrong with the fact that the books do get a lot darker as they go along.
But that's something that I respect. When people now ask me, they know I've been reading this, they say, well, what do you think of it? I say that the fact that I don't know if it was C.S. Lewis or... I think it was G.K. Chesterton that had this quote that said, if you're going to read your books, your children's stories, make sure the dragons are real.
Sure, yeah.
In other words, make sure that there is something terrifying in them, that the darkness is there, that we're not in some cartoon world, which I think a lot of modern kids' literature stays in.
I cannot agree more. I've always been a fan of that type of children's literature.
And she does that.
Where feels like a very real threat.
Yeah.
And I think even the best Disney films do that.
Totally.
Where it's like, oh, okay, so like my father was just killed in front of me, or there is this real fear that this is... Toy Story 3 is a great example of this, in fact, where I was sitting in that audience.
As a kid,
spoiler, right? No, I was not a kid, very much not a kid at that point. But these toys that I did grow up watching when I was a child, when that first movie came out, I've had these characters in my life for like 15 years, and I'm almost convinced that they're about to kill them off in a fire. And I'm like, what are you doing?
Harry Potter
and watching
does
kids
kill
cry,
them off, right?
and watching kids cry in the audience in that exact scene, and be like, whew, okay, this is something we're dealing with.
And that's
you're
something
right.
that Harry Potter does do, because they kill off characters, beloved characters, because of an evil that's very real.
Yeah.
And so the stakes are high, and then the redemption and the sacrifices that are made towards that are more real. And as a Christian, I love that, because in my narrative, the stakes are the dragon of sin and the dragon of the devil is very real, and there is a cost that has to be paid, and that cost is blood. And Harry Potter mimics that a lot, actually.
And for me, I guess why I caught into that a little bit more is because I just like complicated stories like that. I like seeing real stakes being put into place instead of kind of fake drama being put into it, which I don't really like all that much. Where I feel like something could happen to any of our main characters at one time.
Yes.
I really hope it doesn't.
Totally. I'm surprised you didn't kill off the 3 friends.
I am actually surprised too. I was almost convinced that one of them had to.
Yeah.
That one of them had to be killed off.
Dumbledore was a pretty close second.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
and there's a lot of foreshadowing that's going to happen, so I was pretty sure it was going to happen anyways.
So then,
and then, I was about to say that, but what I also think is that as a humanist, I do believe in the goodness of people, but I also realize that a hardship in our life or things that just come easy to us don't make maybe a well-lived life in some ways, meaning that if there isn't a little bit of struggle, then the reward doesn't seem quite as great. And I think that that's what these books also put into place, is that this is an extreme example of it for sure, where there's this kind of evil despot coming back, but we, from that, we're able to grow this better life afterwards.
Time in a different place. Haven't you heard? Haven't you seen? I'm giving up hope, if I know what that means. Haven't you heard? Haven't you seen? Haven't you heard? Haven't you seen?
that's interesting. So then, because for me, the Harry Potter books, reading them now, I see, and I haven't even put thought into this, that they are a very Christian book in that sense, that there is very real evil, that there's a very real sacrifice that has to be made, that there's regular deaths that take place, both figurative and literal. Is that something that came across when you were reading the books, or when you think about them now?
I mean, having been an English major for a while, and the 7th book came out after I got my English degree, so obviously I was reading it in a different way, or in a different mindset in some ways, in that there's a lot in Western literature that is really either directly in reference to the Bible or directly in reference to Christian teachings, or is straight up like this is an homage to Jesus' sacrifice. Or at least you can read it that way, just because everything is either a response or even with a not directly response. There's something, it bleeds into everything, even if you're not trying to explicitly do that.
Right.
So that's how I read it.
That's just how you read it.
Yeah.
Okay. But did it appeal to you at a gut level, in the sense that you're being captured by these stories that profoundly deal with these themes? Or is it just, oh, that's interesting, they're using the Christ motive again?
Yeah, it's probably more the latter than anything else. But for me, I mean, when I started, like I said, the first book is, okay, we have Harry, we have these funny characters that are his sidekicks. Okay, that's great. You get into the second and third one. But by that 4th book, I was totally in. I was like, okay, there's some real danger going on here now. There's a real allusion to the KKK that's going on in these books. We're starting to see that Harry, having been a kid, was sheltered a lot in this world for the first few novels, and now we're starting to see
the stakes,
the real stakes. And I think because I was growing up with them at the time, I could really see that in my own life happening. Whereas you are in school and you have your own stresses and your own things that you're trying to deal with, and then you leave school and you start to see, okay, the stuff that I was worrying about then really doesn't matter.
Right.
I mean, it was mattered to me at the time, but at this point, there's greater things, or there's bigger things. It's the curse of knowledge. I forget who coined that phrase, but the curse of knowledge is the more you know, the more you have to worry about things.
Right.
And you almost wish you didn't know about it so that you didn't have to worry about it.
Right. And so in the sense that these stories are well, let's talk about this, and we'll circle back to that. Is it a closed box world that Harry Potter is?
You brought this up, I think, on our last podcast. This like open box, closed box thing. It's something that I really pay a whole lot of attention to on my day-to-day life, because you are the closed box Is that true?
I'm saying I'm open box in the sense that this world is not all that there is. That
Right.
there is so miracles be an example of an open box.
Right,
The,
I see
the,
what you're
the belief
saying.
of God, the incarnation, that God can come into Earth and interact with us and die for us.
Mm-hmm.
That the fact that when we die, we're not left in this world. That's what I would define as an open box.
Right.
Whereas, from my understanding of humanism, is that no, this world is all there is.
So the closed box is like
Yeah.
the dollhouse type
Yes,
type
sure.
idea where like it's just in this is the
Yes,
only world
that's
that
right.
exists. I mean, yeah. I again, I don't put a lot of thought into it. I think for me, it's an even greater sacrifice then in some ways, that if there is no life after this one, to sacrifice yourself is the ultimate
Interesting.
gift
'Cause
that you can
there's
give to
no-
someone, because you were saying you are more important than I am in this case, and I'm going to sacrifice myself for you.
Right.
Which is interesting that Harry does that and then comes back to life. He is Jesus. He
Well,
is
and there's
Jesus.
even the end of the book 5 of Order of the Phoenix, where his godfather dies, and he's distraught by this and trying to basically communicate with him again. He's running around looking for ghosts, and he's looking for the mirror to see if that's going to work. And then I think it's the Luna character that basically says, "I've been through this, and I have hope beyond this world." Did that come out when you were reading that? Do you
No,
remember
I don't
that?
even
Okay.
remember that point.
Okay.
So.
Because I was even looking after I read that book. I read the Wikipedia summary,
Yeah,
and at the
yeah.
very end, it was like, "And then Luna comforts Harry with the belief of heaven." Was literally how the Wikipedia
Sure,
thing read it. Asked, but let's talk about what you just mentioned. The last scene where Harry does die, and then he meets Dumbledore again,
Yeah.
who's supposed to be dead,
Yeah.
and he basically says, "You got to go back." So is that something that when you read that, because you were at that point out of college, pretty solidified in your belief, I'm guessing. Did that feel cheap? Or did that feel genuine?
That wasn't, well, it felt
Did
a
you
little...
miss God at that point?
I mean, did it feel cheap? That's a good question. I mean, sort of, I guess, because it was something I was hoping she was going to avoid. I was going into that book hoping that she wasn't going to do the whole they die but they didn't really die thing.
Right.
Mostly because that happened in Buffy, that happened in The Matrix, that happened in Star Wars. Like it
Maybe it's 'cause
happens.
it's real, Kyle.
Maybe, but it's happened in so many other properties. It's like
Interesting.
I don't want that to be the thing that happens
Right.
again, where it's like they're dead but they're not really dead, and so
Sure.
they come back to life
Right.
again.
Rather than
Mostly because, and as a comic book reader, I hate when that happens in comic books, because no death actually really means anything in that medium a lot of the time.
Right.
Where, yeah, they're dead, but they're just going to be back in 2 years or in 4 issues from now because of some...
Right.
Doctor Strange comes, waves his hands magically, and
Yeah.
resurrects the dead because
No,
why
it is.
not?
And that kind of cheapens the stakes we talked about earlier, the
Yeah.
dragon, right? If you can come back from death.
Yeah.
But I guess what
I think it would have made a more impactful
Yeah.
on the series if Harry had stayed dead. And his sacrifice still saved everyone.
Right.
But it was Hermione and Ron that picked up the sword and then
that
went
were able
forward.
to do it.
There's also this
Interesting.
huge fan theory that Neville is actually the boy who lived because he fits all the same criteria
Right.
that Harry does, which I think is an interesting
But-
fan theory.
Okay, well, let's skip fan theories and come back to the
Yeah,
central
sure.
challenge here, because you're
But I
saying
want
that
to talk about fan theories.
this episode is now called the fan theories episode.
Yeah. It's a Harry Potter cast.
Yeah, but in the sense that you get frustrated by that, and you don't want that. You're like, that's false. That can't be the case.
Right.
I wonder if a good portion of the magic of Harry Potter and why it appeals to so many people is because we're in a world where what you just stated, maybe it isn't the most common. We go to funerals, we talk about heaven all the time, but it is what is the assumption,
Right.
maybe, of the not modern world. And here comes this series that says there's actually a whole nother level of reality going on.
Sure.
A sense of mystery and magic, if you use that term, that's out there that you can learn about and control. But that there are things like death that you can't control, and yet there's a hope that pervades beyond that perseveres beyond that. There's a higher standard, whether that's a standard of morality, like the Severus character and how he holds himself to a higher standard than we thought the whole time, or if it's an actual something beyond this world, like the hope of eternal life that you see Dumbledore and Harry actually experience.
Is there a question in there? Or
No,
just
I'm
saying
just
that?
curious. Like, because is that something that, because you're reading it going, well, that was a great story, but I didn't believe what it said. I thought that was a lazy, cheap trick.
I think the strength of the Harry Potter universe is that everybody has their own story arcs that are going through it,
Sure.
and they all kind of intersect.
Sure.
And you talk about Severus, the Snape character, who is a very tragic character in many ways. It could be read as creepy in some, because it's like he holds this flame for a woman that he fell in love with as a teenager, was rebuffed, and has kind of held that grudge forever and ever. Yet his love for that one person is what forces him to still be on the side of right, or on the side of good. Right. So he's just a really fascinating character to study, I think. There is the other way of looking at the books of that Dumbledore really is a villain in many ways, because he knows that Harry's going to die and doesn't tell him.
Sure.
And so
he keeps that
from him, which is something that's a little bit of a jerk thing to do, and puts
and
him into harm's way. Specifically because he knows he has to die in order for the world to be saved. So there's these interesting character arcs where you think of characters one way when the series starts. At the end, it's a bit of shades of gray going on. There's definitely the ones like the Malfoy family is absolutely probably evil. And Voldemort himself is very evil. Never was really any shade of gray there. But for many of the other people, even Harry himself in book 5 is basically let's be emo and be like a jerk for the entire book.
And see, I think that's one of the strengths of the series that can teach you a lot. Because growing up, I talked about my disdain for Harry Potter and my disdain for those that read it. But I would say that feeling of disdain for others was very much something I grew up with. Someone who is gay or someone who is an atheist, all these like, wow, can't associate with them. And then what you learn as you get to know these people is that they're not how you think. That there's a lot more going on. And yet, when you look at it from the Christian worldview, you talk about the absolute evils that are out there. There are absolute evils that are out there. There is evil. But most of the people that you might think, based on your tribalism, is on the side of evil, there's a lot more going on. And I think Harry Potter, the book series, pulls that apart a lot. And what you said too, that those that you're cheering for, those whose skin you're in most of the time, you realize that they do some jerk things too. And so I think the way that that she teaches that to young readers growing up is one of the more powerful probably side effects of that book's effect on us.
Well, the greatest literature does teach empathy at the end of the day, because it should take us into people's skins that maybe we don't understand or that we don't necessarily always identify with, and still like them at the end of the day. We still understand where they're coming from. Maybe like is not the wrong word there, but we understand where they're coming from.
No, and empathy is one of the best things about literature and art, and certainly in Harry Potter. What other stuff did you find out about Harry Potter?
Well,
I remember, this is something that just occurred to me now, but I remember talking to one of my pastors, and he said our kids read Harry Potter growing up, and we hid them so that nobody else knew. We didn't want to have that discussion with every church member that walked into our home, but they did. And one of the reasons we really wanted them to read it was because of the sense of self-reliance that Harry battles with. I remember reading it just this last year. It was one of the strong themes that came out. It's Harry's trying to do this on his own, and he's trying to keep all these feelings and thoughts and ideas to himself, even though he knows he should just knock on that office door and tell Dumbledore. And you want him to go knock on that office door and talk about it. And he said that's something that, well, let me put it this way. When I look at my own life, even now, it's so hard for me to go to advice and open up to people.
Right.
And I think of myself and like, look, Harry's so stupid not to do that. Why am I so stupid not to do that?
Right.
It's an interesting little minor lesson, I think, from those books.
I guess for me, it's I always struggled with this growing up, where that I always was kind of disappointed in real life in many ways because it wasn't an adventure, or I didn't see the adventure in it, I guess is a better way to put it.
No potion classes.
What's that?
There's no potion classes.
There's no potions classes, that's right. I just want to make some gillyweed. There's... When I was reading all these mystery novels growing up, and when I was delving into Middle Earth and stuff like that, it's like, oh man, I wish I could go on an adventure. Maybe something will happen at school today, or maybe something will happen on this summer day where I have to be the hero, or I have to go on a journey, or I have to find a fellowship and we can kind of do this together. It never really happened or happens.
Is it this podcast or fellowship?
Maybe this is our fellowship. We just have to get 12 more members.
That's right. It's 9.
9, sorry, yes, you're right. 9 more members. Good thing there's no test on this. And so going into these flights of fancy, it was always like, I'm in on this quest with these people. I'm the fly on the wall for these journeys. And then going back to real life, it's like, I'm just back here doing my thing. But I think in my adult years, I realized that there's maybe not specifically like a one-to-one correlation between what I'm doing now and going and slaying a dragon.
Right.
But there's a journey I'm on, and
Right.
there's struggles I have, and there can be excitement to be had along the way. And I like to solve mysteries in my van. So there's that.
Well, this was a good conversation because I think it's interesting how these books that I can read them and I can say I see the Christian logic, internal logic to the series. Man, they must be a powerful thing that everybody's reading these. And I talk to you that grew up in them, and you're like, yeah, meh. Maybe it's there, and maybe I need to listen to it, but I also disagree with it.
Well, yeah, and again, it's just because I was not growing up with that. I mean, if I was like directly involved in the church, I'm sure I would have picked on those themes up a lot more, and I would have tied them into my own life. I'm usually, again, that English major person who's looking at like themes and the way people are telling stories and color theory and all this other stuff that's going on in books like that.
There's a lot of that.
And still just like enjoying the ride going along. I'm normally a person who likes the surface level first and then likes to dig deeper instead of going deeper and then trying to come back up to the surface level.
Right.
I'm not a mole man.
Is that vacuum going to be a problem? Can you hear it?
I can hear it, but that's all right. It adds character to our podcast.
Okay.
We're not doing it in a basement. We're doing it in an attic loft.
Attic loft, yeah, with vacuums all around. I wonder how that, because my worldview believes that there is that higher purpose that you almost yearn for, you just expressed, that adventure, that there are stakes that are for everybody, and so even if we're not doing potion class, we still are involved in this high stakes battle for good and evil in the background. And I wonder if, like, even though you don't recognize those themes because you didn't grow up with them, if one of the reasons you like the books is because they recognize the reality, that they tap into that in some way.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it was a completely closed off world that the books portrayed, I wonder if they would have had that same...
Possibly. I mean, again, because I was getting more politically active at the time. I mean, they were coming at
You were joining the KKK.
Yes, that is what I was doing. No, I mean, they came out at the end of the Clinton administration. Yeah. Where I think people had a much more positive outlook on the future. Sure. And then they, number 5 came out after 9/11 happened, which was just a total game changer where people started to really distrust the government a lot more.
And also maybe realize that there is a life and death stakes game going on around our lives.
So I think there's this big cosmic shift, and it really did happen, like I say, kind of at the right time as this. Not that, I don't want to say that 9/11 happened at the right time. That's not what I meant by that statement. But what I'm saying is that you can really see that shift of like children's literature, and then this is real life and death stakes, geopolitical stuff that's happening. There's a real big shift between the first half and the last half of this story.
They grow up.
They grow up. Yeah. And I think the world, or North America at least, grew up. And I was coming of age at that time too. Right. So everything was kind of just boom, happening at the same time. So it all kind of is happening in my mind at the same time for me.
Right. Well, what did you learn? I learned something. What did you learn from this
From our
discussion?
talk? Yeah. Well, I think what I'm discovering in this podcast is just understanding that the people's upbringings obviously influence how they look at the world. Yeah. But I find it fascinating to be like, there can be so many different interpretations of the same book or piece of media. Oftentimes when people say like, I love this movie, or no, I hated this movie, we have those two like huge vast clips. It's like, I feel like I was not watching the same movie as you, or I was not reading the same book as you. And it's kind of true. You probably weren't, because you just didn't have all this other experience you've had that the other person does.
Totally. And I mentioned in the podcast just now about Harry's the book's way of pulling back the layers of what you think are villains. And guess what? That's what we're doing on this podcast.
That's right.
Right? But in a sense, I think that's very important to go, okay, here's someone that I disagree with and my tribe disagrees with. Mm-hmm. Let's understand them better. And we should still disagree in the end, maybe. Mm-hmm. But we understand why a little more, and we see it's not so black and white in the end.
Which I like. But before we end off here today, we would talk primarily about the books. Yeah. Have you seen any of the movies?
I have not. No, I haven't.
Okay.
Should I?
Kind of, I guess. I was never a big fan of the movies. Okay. There's a lot of people that there are out there. If you just wanted to have some of the same feeling, right, instead of having to read the book again, then yes, throw it on. What I always disliked about it is that they got the story beats sometimes right. They just didn't get the feeling of Harry Potter right. Yeah. Except for number 3, which Alfonso Cuarón directed.
I want to watch that one.
But it's also the one that diverts the most from the source material. Right. But as far as an adaptation goes, I'm of the opinion that I want you to get the feel right. Sure. Not necessarily this happens and then this happens and then this happens. Totally. It's a movie. It's a different medium, so just do what you need to do to make this feel right. Yeah. So I think that movie number 3 hits that on the head. What's your favorite book of the series?
Number 3.
Number 3. I'm a number 4 person. Number 4 is like my bread and butter. Yeah. No. And then I respect some other ones. Yeah. Like I say, number 5, in retrospect, there's a lot of things that it needs to do. It just is hampered because I think she should have edited about 200 pages.
Number 3 is the first one that blew my mind.
Got it.
And it's also the one that I think I cheered up over the first one. So it hooked me emotionally, and then I understood like how she was changing the game, as it were.
Well, what I respected about at least the last 4 is that it's essentially a different type of story every time. Like the first 3 are very standard. Go to school, this thing happens, resolution at the end. And then the 4, we have this tournament, which is a little bit different thing. The 5th one is like very upsetting, and there's a lot of like things going on. But number 6 is really just a dialogue between Dumbledore and Harry for most of the book, which I thought was a really interesting way. And number 7, they don't go to school at all. Yeah. And so I just thought that was interesting that she started to try and really.
And yet the arc, like if you read about Harry Potter, there is a hero's journey to each book. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting. This is something to think about, but how Harry either really does die or goes underground, and is every time in the book, if you look, he's persuaded that he is going to die. Yeah. But he basically gives up hope and embraces death in each book. Oh, interesting. And he's saved by some other source in each book. Yeah. It's not him that pulls himself out of the coffin. It's something else, whether it's the Phoenix or another character or magic deeper that pulls him back up. And that to me is a huge Christ imagery that's in every book.
Of course. Well, maybe I should reread the series again. I have read The Cursed Child. Yeah. But it is very much a play, so it's something I should be watching, I think, instead of actually reading. I haven't yet. So I'm not the biggest fan of the prose in that book, but it's not prose, it's the stage direction. So it's like, okay, it feels stilted a little bit when I'm reading it in my head. You just dropped something on the floor. Mm-hmm. So there's that, and then Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them is kind of this evolution. It's kind of the prequel trilogy, or I guess 5 films.
I
or
wish
something
you were writing it, not directing it, or writing the screenplay. But
you wish I was writing?
No, I do. I wish she was writing the actual book.
Oh, me too. She's writing the screenplay. I hated that movie.
You mentioned that.
I really disliked it, which is surprising because but she's writing it, right? But you can tell that she's a book writer, not a screenwriter. Yeah. I think is what it is. Yeah. It's like she's probably putting in all these illusions that would be really cool on the page. Yeah. But
they just don't come across.
They don't work together, and the main character doesn't do anything, and that's me going into my film snobbery class. Anyway.
Speaking of dragons, we are going to be talking about a rather real dragon.
Yeah, we get to talk about something else you had disdain for growing up, which is video games.
And we're all, speaking of high stakes battle between good and evil and everyday adventure, I think the next episode will talk about all of that.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Yeah. That's going to happen in like 2 minutes for us, but in a couple weeks for everyone listening.
Thanks for listening. Do tell us what you think, and cue the credits.
Well, welcome to the credits. This has been Assumptions. It's produced by Daniel Melville Jones and myself, Kyle Marshall. This episode, I know this is crazy, but was edited by Kyle Marshall. The theme song was To the Sky, sung by the Parson Redheads off of their album Orb Weaver. You know, the podcast artwork was designed by Chris Taniguchi, and feedback or questions, as we said at the beginning of the episode, can be sent to assumptionspod@gmail.com. Don't feel like you have to look in a cupboard underneath the stairs. You can find us by searching Assumptions Podcast on Facebook and Twitter. And I almost forgot, but Peace in the Valley was another song we used in this episode, and it's also sung by the Parson Redheads. Weird. We don't have any sponsors on this podcast, but go and buy a Casper mattress anyways. And while you're doing that, on the next episode of
I
assumptions.
grew up thinking video games were not necessarily of the devil, like we talked about last episode on Harry Potter, but more a waste of your total time.
They were Lucifer adjacent, is what they were.
They were like, what do you, they ate up whatever was in its wake.
So why specifically was that?
Oh, the waste of time idea
Yeah.
behind it. Well, I still like have this certain grudge against video games because of the idea that you're not reading something, you're not consuming something, you're not working on something. You're just playing.
You never played a Final Fantasy game then. All you do is read in those games. That's next time on Assumptions.